Hello, I'm Dr. Cheryl Chase. Welcome to Chasing Your Potential. Today, I'll be talking about the executive functions. The term executive functioning is becoming a much more commonly used term in both schools and pediatricians' offices. There's a lot of misunderstanding of what the executive functions are, so today I'm hoping to clear it up for you so you can understand what these executive functions are. There are a lot of different models of executive functioning, which can leave people really confused. The bottom line is they're not all that different after all. All of these models stress that the executive functions are independent, they involve self-regulation, they're things that a person is doing themselves privately, and when done properly, they allow the person to regulate themselves and function in a way that allows them to stay on task over time. The model I like to follow was put forth by Russ Barkley. In Dr. Barkley's, there are 5 executive functions, as opposed to some models that have 7, 10, or even as many as 30. 5 is just a lot easier to manage. These 5 executive functions are inhibition, sensing to the self, self-speech, emotion and motivation to the self, and reconstitution or play to the self. The first executive function is inhibition. Inhibition has 3 aspects. The first one is shutting off an ongoing behavior when that's appropriate. In other words, the outside behavior, running, jumping, using loud voices, is not appropriate when you come inside and start working on a math worksheet. So inhibition shuts off that outside behavior and turns on the inside behavior, which is the second aspect of inhibition, turning on another set of behaviors when that's appropriate. So, sitting down and doing your math worksheet, or washing your hands and coming to the dinner table. Inhibition is very responsible there as well. And the third area is protecting the other executive functions from interference. I think of it like inhibition not only clears the table, but keeps the table clear so that the other executive functions can have a place to work. The next executive function is called sensing to the self. Sensing to the self is a form of working memory. Now, many people have heard the term working memory, but don't entirely know what it means. The best description of working memory I've ever heard is it's like your counter space when you're baking. If you're baking for the holidays and your counter is too small, you're not going to have enough space to work. You get your mixer up on the counter, you get your flour up on the counter, and there's nowhere for your eggs or for your recipe, and everything is just a stressful mess. However, if you're cooking in a commercial kitchen with huge stainless steel counters, you've got plenty of room for all of your ingredients and your recipe and your mixer, and you can work flawlessly and without anxiety because you have plenty of space and plenty of room to manipulate everything you need to. Working memory is your kitchen counter space. Sensing to the self is nonverbal working memory. So it's holding in place complex behavioral sequences. It's holding in place what it takes to learn how to play a tune on the piano. It's holding in place what it takes to learn how to form a letter when you're writing. And one of the areas that is most difficult for kids with problems in this area is copying off the board or learning vicariously. Their teacher shows them how to make a letter A, but they can't translate that into their own actions. And so we talk about sensing to the self as a difficulty in doing non-verbal working memory or holding sequences, behavioral sequences in mind long enough to be able to learn to do them for yourself. The next executive function is called self-speech. Now, like sensing to the self, which is non-verbal working memory, self-speech is verbal working memory, holding in mind words long enough to problem solve, long enough to think reflectively about what it is you're about to do, long enough to solve a math problem, for example, or even reading comprehension. Now, they've done some research and found that in even good readers who are adults, when one is reading to oneself, small muscles in the mouth and lips and tongue are moving Why? Because we're actually talking to ourselves as we're reading. And so when we look at self-speech as one of the executive skills, what we're looking at is the ability to hold words in mind long enough to do something with them. And so it may be solving an algebra problem, talking yourself through when you're going to borrow or carry, when you're doing subtraction or addition. And again, in reading comprehension, when we're trying to understand what we're reading, holding in mind the beginning of a sentence so that we can link it up to the end of a sentence by the time we're done reading a full sentence. So just like sensing to the self is working memory of the nonverbal kind, self-speech is working memory of the verbal kind. The next executive function is known as emotion or motivation to the self. In other words, what gets you going? What fires you up? What gets you out of bed in the mornings? And then if you're having a bad day, how do you cheer yourself up? How do you bring yourself back to being productive? When you're feeling overwhelmed, like the world is closing in and there's no way you can keep up, how do you keep persevering? Emotion and motivation to the self is an extremely important executive function, and probably the one that I am seeing families with in my practice the most. This is where people get most frustrated and upset. When I'm having a bad day, how do I persevere? When I don't understand what is being asked of me, how do I get the help I need? When it's not fun anymore, how do I keep going and get the work done? How do I cheer myself up? But then conversely, if you're having a great day, how do you calm yourself down and get back to work? Now take a minute to stroll down memory lane. Do you remember high school? Do you remember the week of homecoming? Do you remember how hard it was to stay focused and concentrating on what you're doing? What if he asked you to homecoming? How do you go through algebra? What if he didn't ask you to homecoming? How do you get through social studies or history? So emotion and motivation to the self, regulating what gets you going, regulating your emotions is an extremely, extremely important executive function. The fifth and final executive function is known as reconstitution, or play to the self. What does that involve? It's a complex name, but a really simple idea. The bottom line is novel problem solving, coming up with new and diverse ways to solve a problem. In other words, how do I get the job done if the tools I'm used to having around aren't available? If I forget my math book, what do? Do I call a friend? Do I go in early? How do I solve the problem if I don't have the tools available? Now, the other thing about reconstitution, and the reason Barkley calls it play to the self, is because in adulthood, it is a form of play. It is kind of fun to come up with new and novel ways of solving problems. If you remember the old TV show MacGyver could get himself out of the most difficult situations with maybe a piece of chewing gum, a paper clip, and an old match. That's the idea here with reconstitution, taking old things, making them new, engaging in novel problem solving, and finding new ways to address problems so that in the end, you get the job done. So as you can see, the 5 executive functions aren't too difficult to understand. You got this. There's inhibition, there's sensing to the self, which is nonverbal working memory, there's self-speech, which is verbal working memory, there's emotion and motivation to the self, and there's reconstitution or play to the self. Those 5 executive functions are extremely important in pursuing our goals and achieving what we want to achieve in life. I'm sure you'll find this information helpful as you're out there chasing your potential.